Welcome to the Belly Button Window channel and episode 24 of the Jimi Hendrix story, like you've never heard it before. In this episode, we give you the deep dive into July 1968, including the Woburn Music Festival, the ongoing recording of the Electric Ladyland album, and the beginning of the second North American tour. Please remember to check the channel's community tab and video information page, where you will find links to related videos, performances, and stunning photographs from the period. By July 1968, while the Axis LP was still a top-selling album, Jimi had long since moved on to new challenges, increasingly brought to fruition through the Electric Lady recording sessions. While touring commitments were few, highlights included the Woburn Music Festival in England in early July, which would be the last English gig until January 1969. Then at the end of the month, shows at the Independence Hall in Baton Rouge and Municipal Auditorium, Shreveport, Louisiana, which kicked off the band's second grueling 1968 US tour, whose itinerary would effectively keep the group busy throughout the remainder of the year. Monday the 1st of July and the Jimi Hendrix Experience are at the record plant in New York, working on the recording of And the Gods Made Love. Later that evening, Jimi jams with the Graham Bond Organization. Wednesday, the 3rd of July, sees the group recording and mixing at the record plant studios, working on All Along the Watchtower. Jimi and Gary Kellgren mixed All Along the Watchtower with the final master mix, but in the end, it was rejected in favor of the previous mix that Hendrix had made with Eddie Kramer, back in January 1968 at Olympic Studios in London. According to Shapiro and Glabeek, Jimi, Dave Mason and Vic Price were at a small party where they all got to listen to Bob Dylan's John Wesley Harding LP for the very first time. When it got to All Along the Watchtower, Jimi said, "We got to record that. I got to do that." That same evening, Jimi recorded the song at Olympic. Kathy Etchingham recalled, "Jimi's great hero was Bob Dylan. I think they only met once in New York and were both too stoned to do much more than grin at each other. When he brought the John Wesley Harding album back from America, we played it over and over again. Then he thought he would do All Along the Watchtower, but was terrified that Dylan would laugh at him and the critics lay into him. Just do it, I told him. Don't worry so much." He got together a bunch of musicians, including Dave Mason and Brian Jones, who turned up with the most enormous sitar, and we headed down to the studio in Barnes. As soon as he got there and started playing, Jimi realized he had brought the wrong guitar. It wasn't quite the tone he wanted or something, and he sent me back in a taxi to get another one. When he finally got going, the music just flowed out of him, and even Dylan has been quoted as saying that on the resulting track, Jimi had made the song his own. Jimi would later say, "I felt like Watchtower was something I'd written, but could never get together. I often felt that about Bob Dylan." Thursday, the 4th of July, Jimi, Mitch and Noel travel from New York to Heathrow International Airport in London. Back in London, Jimi moves into his new flat at 23 Brook Street in London W1. Friday, the 5th of July. Jimi is photographed in Edgeware Road by Kevin Brewer on the corner of Upper Berkeley Street, London. Kathy Etchingham. "I think it was the time when we were house training Jimi's puppy, Ethel Flume. Back then, there weren't any free newspapers to assist with training the puppy, so Jimi used to go to the newsagents in Edgeware Road. One day, he was stopped by a young man who took some pictures. They got chatting about cameras, and Jimi went to a shop in Edgeware Road recommended by this man and bought a movie camera. Also on this day, the Jimi Hendrix Experience is featured in Go magazine, July 5th, 1968 edition. Saturday, the 6th of July, and the Woburn Music Festival. Woburn Abbey, Bedfordshire is headlined by the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Other performers at the 1968 festival included Pentangle, Alexis Corner, Donovan, Geno Washington, Tyrannosaurus Rex, The Family, John Miles Bluesbreakers, and New Formula and Little Women amongst others. Set list for the show: Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Fire, Tax Free, Red House, Foxy Lady, Voodoo Child, and Purple Haze. Also on the 6th of July, the Jimi Hendrix Experience is featured in the following music magazines and newspapers: Melody Maker, where the Smash Hits album sits at number 9 on the top 10 LPs chart, and New Musical Express, where the Smash Hits album sits at number 9 on the top 15 LPs. The Woburn Music Festival, held over the 6th and the 7th of July of 1968, was one of Britain's first large-scale open-air rock music events. Staged by brothers Richard Rick and John Gunnell, who were well-respected individuals in the burgeoning London music scene, where they were heavily involved in many aspects including band management, promotion, and club ownership. Rick, in particular, who owned 3 fashionable 1960s London night spots, the Ram Jam Club, Flamingo and Bag O' Nails, presented authentic first-generation American icons like John Lee Hooker and Otis Redding, and some of the brightest examples of a swelling wave of emerging British talent such as the Rolling Stones, Jack Bruce, and Georgie Fame. People standing in their gardens 2 miles away from Woburn Abbey could hear strains of pop music floating on the air. As dusk fell along with the temperature, the festival attendance reached a peak of over 14,000. Emperor Roscoe compared the evening session and swung things along with records and tapes in between sets from Little Women, New Formula, Geno Washington, Tyrannosaurus Rex, The Family, and Jimi Hendrix Experience, blasting his way into the midnight hour. Already fires were being built and lit all over the field. The bill was a pretty eclectic one, veering wildly into the realms of pseudo-soul, far-out psychedelic rock, psychedelic folksy rock, and back to genuine get down and dance to the music soul in the form of Geno Washington and the Ram Jam Band. At Woburn, Jimmy skipped songs from Axis, bold as love altogether, electing instead to jam, as he called it, kicking off his set with a spirited Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The trio followed with fire, and despite beset with buzzing, crackles and otherwise unwanted noises throughout their set, the Experience continued to persevere, doing their best to surmount the technical problems that hampered an otherwise animated set. Although opting to bypass music from Axis, bold as love, Hendrix did foreshadow his next album at Woburn, stretching out a marvelous 10-plus minute version of Tax-Free, an early contender for Electric Ladyland and a favorite Experience vehicle for improvisation. Hendrix followed up with another extended, improvisational rendition of Red House, before closing the show with a trio of live concert stalwarts Foxy Lady, Voodoo Child, Slight Return, and Purple Haze. In launching into Purple Haze, Jimmy kicked off a boisterous feedback opening, buttressed by Mitchell and Redding, and complete with tremolo bar swoops, wah-wah pedal shadings and soaring dive bomb-styled bursts that transitioned seamlessly into the song's unmistakable opening notes. At its conclusion, the audience roared with approval. While no microphones were positioned to fully capture the intensity of their reaction, their enthusiasm and calls for more can be easily heard through Jimmy and Noel's stage microphones. The Experience's performance at Woburn Music Festival would mark the trio's last performance in England until the 2 celebrated concerts in February 1969 at the Royal Albert Hall. Sunday, the 7th of July, in the midst of the final touches on the Electric Ladyland album, and a day after performing at the Woburn Music Festival, Hendrix acted as a concert-goer at the 68 Sounds concert, a fundraiser hosted by Keystone for the National Association of Boys Clubs. The concert featured Traffic and Pretty Thing, The Move, and featuring other bands such as The Byrds, The Easy Beats, The Bonzo Dog Band, Joe Cocker, and The Alan Bone, accompanied by a certificate of authenticity from Trax. A rare vintage program from the Sounds, 68 Acai concert at the Royal Albert Hall in London on July 7, 1968, signed on the cover in black ballpoint pen by Jimi Hendrix. The recipient of the autograph detailed the story in an accompanying letter of provenance. This Jimi Hendrix autograph was obtained by my mother on Sunday, July 7, 1968, at the Royal Albert Hall in London. Jimmy was in the audience watching the show. My mother was in the music industry at the time and often had tickets to many of the shows she took me to, although I was only 11 years old and wasn't always happy to go. People were going to get Jimmy's autograph while he was sitting down, but we managed to get his autograph when we came out. We saw him waiting for a taxi with his entourage. My mother always remarked on how polite he was and watched me say that the fans were getting younger and younger. Monday, the 8th of July, Alan Walsh interviews Hendrix at the Anim office, Gerrard Street in London, for Melody Maker photos by Barry Wentzell, who remembers this moment. On a rather gloomy and rainy afternoon, I went to see Jimmy to take some photos for the next tour he was starting, just after returning from a long tour in the United States. When I arrived, I found him alone in his manager, Mike Jeffrey's office, slumped in a chair behind a desk filled with paperwork and confusion. Jimmy seemed a little depressed. While taking a few pictures, I asked him if he was okay. He looked up and said, "Sorry, but it's all this business stuff, and the pressure of touring all the time, and all I want to do is write and perform my music." He looked out the window and I took this pensive portrait. Tuesday, the 9th of July. Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell and Jimmy participate in a jam session at Blaze Club in London. Thursday the 11th of July, and the Jimi Hendrix experience is featured in the following music magazines and newspapers. The RAG. While Friday the 12th of July, the experience is featured in Go magazine, where the Are You Experienced LP sits at number 9 on the top 20 albums chart, and the East Village Other newspaper. Then Saturday, the 13th of July, the group is featured in Disc and Music Echo, where the Smash Hits album sits at number 8 on the top 10 LPs chart, and Melody Maker, where Smash Hits sits at number 8 on the top 10 LPs chart. Monday, the 15th of July, and the Jimi Hendrix experience were the opening act at the Sgt. Pepper's Club, Palma, Mallorca in Spain. Sgt. Pepper's was a basement discotheque owned by Mike Jeffrey and Chas Chandler. The two men had invested big in Sgt. Pepper's. The sound system was out of this world. A psychedelic light show was augmented by explosions, confetti and dry ice. The decor was groovy, baby. Originally, the experience was booked for Music 68, a music festival planned for July of that year at the Bullring in Palma. Bands booked for the festival included the Byrds, Incredible String Band, and the Animals. After the promoters pulled out, the festival was cancelled. But by then, Hendrix and the group were already on their way. Hendrix arrived in Palma on the morning of the 14th of July. Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell had arrived a week before. Now that he was on the island, Hendrix or his manager, Mike Jeffrey, decided that he might as well inaugurate Sgt. Pepper's. No one knows for sure if that's the reason why, in front of an audience that included footballer George Best, Hendrix put his guitar through the club's roof while he was playing Purple Haze. Maybe it was simply that the roof was too low. He could also have been frustrated by the sound which, despite the system, was said to have been awful. For the next few days, thanks to a cancelled show in Madrid, Hendrix and his bandmates had time on their hands for a little vacation on Mallorca. The following is an excerpt from New Musical Express, July 27, 1968, titled, Jimmy Brings Manager's New Club Roof Down. Getting Around Mallorca with NME's Keith Altham. Jimi Hendrix literally brought the roof down on the opening night at his manager's club, Sgt. Pepper's in Mallorca, by the simple expedient of ramming the neck of his guitar up through the low ceiling tiles. Amid thunderous applause, the experience exited in a shower of plaster and debris after a series of brilliantly electronic histrionics. Even manager Chas Chandler, somewhat ruefully surveying the ventilated ceiling in his brand new club, observed, "No matter how many times I see them, they always knock me out." The group were introduced by flowerpot man Neil Landon, traveling with our party in the company of Noel Redding, with whom he is involved in a songwriting partnership. He requested that all those on the dance floor sit down, reiterating with Hitlerian emphasis, "You will sit down or you will be shot." Immediately there was much sitting down, especially among the German contingent, before Neil announced, "For what you are about to receive, may the Lord make you truly thankful." On stage walked drummer Mitch Mitchell, known now to a select few as the Julie Andrews of the group, bass guitarist Noel Redding, and the man with the guitar that whips the flesh as well as the soul. The experience rolls along the motorways of the mind and the airways of the imagination. For the first two numbers, their own amplification fought a whatathon with the club's PA system, before Chas finally gave the group system best and let them loose on their own gear. Each of the group has something to say through Hey Joe, Burning of the Midnight Lamp, Purple Haze, and The Wind Cries Mary, but Hendrix is the supreme conversationalist on the guitar. Mitch attacks 100 drums with a dozen hands and feet, while Noel pounds his bass through the electric storm on his right, raised by the Odin of the guitar. In between the squealing static, the flailing and the wailing and the erotic gestures, the Black Prince mutters over the amplifiers, and finally arrives at the song he calls our national anthem, Wild Thing, which wraps everything and everyone up. We have just been the victims of one of those all-too-rare appearances of the Jimi Hendrix experience, who now average about $30,000 a concert in the US. "What really knocked me out is that the boys offered to do this one for me free," said Chas. "I'm going to give them the gate money anyway, but they asked me if they could open the club themselves." Chas spends much of his time charging about like an enraged water buffalo, correcting minor defects in staff and controls. He worries about the club and the club worries about Chas. It is warriors like Chas who will make Sgt. Pepper's into the little gold mine it undoubtedly is to be. I arrived in Palma on Sunday with Noel. Jimmy and Mitch did their famous plane missing trick, and that evening we watched one of the most exciting bullfights I've ever seen. That evening we ate in a Torino restaurant which was formerly a boutique owned by Chas. There Noel treated us to an impersonation of the yet-to-arrive Mitch, Bouncing up the restaurant stairs and creating the maximum amount of noise, he darted about on his toes, breezing, "Oh, sorry, I'm late. What's going on? Can I have some of that? I forgot my money. Can you pay for it?" Collapse of some few who know the ways of Mitch. Noel came over to our table to say hello to footballer George Best, with whom he became quite friendly, and Jimmy stopped by to exchange insults with me, our way of passing the time. His favorite dart on this holiday was to refer to me as the little old electric lobster, due to my over-enthusiastic crash course on a suntan. Briefly, Jimmy and I discussed his lack of personal appearances in Britain. "We're not deserting Britain or anything like that," said Jimmy. "We are hoping to do some big city concerts in October. We'd like to have someone like the Small Faces with us, but there's probably problems over who would top or something silly. There's an American group called The Spirit right now that I would like to have with us." Mitch made one clear point about why they must play America again soon. "Because that's where we are treated best," he explained. "Look, our most recent album has cost us $70,000 to produce. We've got to get that money back before we can start showing a profit, and America is where you earn the big money. There is still that feeling in Britain when we play some places that they want to make money out of us, and that's all. They treat us like dirt, give us £1,000 and think they are doing us a favor." Meanwhile, Chaz is having kittens about the volume of sound coming from the club from Jimmy's rehearsal, and keeps talking about impending doom. He need not have worried. The Guardia Civil were very civil about the whole thing. George Best appeared mesmerized by the experience's performance on stage, and the whole evening was an enormous success. Tuesday saw a brief appearance of Hendrix and company on our beach at Loro Verde. There, Jimmy ventured into the sea for the first time in 8 years. The spectacle of Mitch and Noel, they came up whiter than white, was too much for most of the amateur home movie exponents on the beach, who pointed whirring machines at them. Noel and Mitch obligingly gibbered about like subhumans and danced up and down, waving their arms. Jimmy came out of the sea swearing his lungs had collapsed. "You wouldn't believe it, but we've got Jimmy insured for $1 million, said Chaz, and the doctor said he was the fittest man he had ever seen. Chaz broke off to address the frail figure of Redding in his bathing trunks. "We've got to get you insured too," he said, "but I'm frightened to let you take the medical." The highlight of Wednesday's activities was a visit to the go-kart track, the first time for Hendrix and Noel. Mitch duly informed me he was buying a Formula One with gears to race it seriously. Jimmy really took to the racing, and was doing quite well, though he kept being driven off the track by an innocent young girl, ending up ignominiously among a heap of rubber tires. "I kept trying to play it fair, and not bump any of the other cars off the track," he told me later. He was still there an hour after Mitch, Noel and I left. The payoff to this experience was next day when I met Jimmy with a lump out of his back and a badly grazed thigh. Apparently he was under the impression that he was back in the paratroopers and had tried an ejector seat release from his go-kart, but the chute had not opened. We were all sorry we missed that one. That night, Jimmy made an impromptu return to the club with Mitch and Noel, and they let loose a never-to-be-forgotten rock and roll session, including numbers like Lucille and Johnny B. Goode. Jimmy broke a string on his guitar, but played better on 5 than most do on 6. His final remark about the visit to Mallorca was to Chaz, "I wish I had listened to you 2 years ago about this place." It was a highly enjoyable working holiday, and Mallorca is likely to be seeing more of Hendrix at Sgt. Pepper's. Friday the 19th of July, and the Jimi Hendrix Experience, depart Mallorca flying back to London, England. While later that evening at the Revolution Club, London, Jimmy takes part in a jam session with unknown musicians. On the same day, the experience is featured in the following music magazines and newspapers: The Great Speckled Bird, July 19th, 1968 edition, and The Word Ungarbled, July 15th, 1968 edition. Saturday the 20th of July, and the Jimi Hendrix Experience is featured in the following music magazines and newspapers: Melody Maker, where the Smash Hits album sits at number 10 on the Top 10 LPs chart, and Disc and Music Echo, where Smash Hits also sits at number 10 on the Top 10 albums chart. Monday the 22nd of July, interview with Black Music Magazine. Thursday the 25th of July. The Experience left England to begin their second tour of North America in 1968. Friday the 26th of July, Record Plant, working on House Burning Down and Long Hot Summer Night. Saturday the 27th of July, interview with Hullabaloo Magazine. The Jimi Hendrix Experience is also featured in the following music magazines and newspapers: Top Pops, July 27th, 1968 edition, and New Musical Express, July 27, 1968 edition, which features Keith Altham's article Mallorca and Jimmy, while listing the smash hits album at number 15 on the top 15 LPs chart. Sunday, the 28th of July, according to Kathy Etchingham. Now that Jimmy and I had a roof over our head, the only problem was furniture. We didn't even have a bed of our own at that stage, let alone carpets and curtains and all the other things that first-time homeowners suddenly find they have to acquire. I had never put my mind to buying furniture before and wasn't sure where to begin. It seemed like the sort of thing we should do as a couple. So when Jimmy arrived back from America in July, I booked us into the Londonderry Hotel in Park Lane for a couple of days, and we set off to do a bit of shopping. We got a bed delivered and went to choose all the basics that we needed, which included turquoise velvet curtains and flame-colored carpets, very unusual colors at that time. Jimmy enjoyed choosing the colors and textures and discussing them with the sales staff. Other shoppers stopped and stared in amazement, not expecting to see Jimi Hendrix discussing patterns in the curtain department of John Lewis's. Jimmy left me with £1,000 to pay for everything, which seemed like a fortune, while he went back to the States to resume his tour. Monday, the 29th of July, sees the group back at the record plant in New York, working on Long Hot Summer Night. Tuesday, the 30th of July, Independence Hall, Lakeshore Auditorium, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. 2 shows supported by Soft Machine. Not a good start to the tour, as Hendrix's Marshall amp stacks exploded at the start of the first show, and Noel Redding was struggling with a new 6-string bass. Noel Redding recalled, "The tour started off smoothly. We left the next morning at 7 a.m. to fly to New Orleans with the driver to Baton Rouge. The first concert was a bit hard for me. I made the mistake of buying an Epiphone 6-string bass and expecting to play it without any practice. Although it sounded good, it proved very difficult to play. But I didn't have to fight with her for long. She was stolen almost instantly. Not the best start to a tour." He goes on to say, "We all missed the plane the next morning and had to go to Shreveport. We decide to stop for a bite to eat at a cafe near Shreveport. However, we are surprised that Jimmy is very hesitant to accompany us. We really need to coax him. But once through the door, we find out why. The whole cafe goes silent, and everyone turns to us, to Jimmy, who is obviously very black in a very white situation. The tension is so thick you could have walked on it. We eat quickly. The whole scene is such fear and drag. We had never encountered this heavy Southern evil vibe before." On the same day, the Jimi Hendrix Experience is featured in the following music magazines and newspapers: Morning Advocate, July 30th, 1968 edition, and a feature article in the Baltimore Afro-American, July 30th, 1968 edition. Wednesday, the 31st of July, Municipal Auditorium, Shreveport, Louisiana. Partial set list: Spanish Castle Magic, Foxy Lady, Purple Haze, Fire, Red House, and Tax Free. Notably, Jimi Hendrix uses a purple Fender guitar in Shreveport, as well as playing his black Gibson Les Paul guitar during this show. On the same day, the Jimi Hendrix Experience is featured in Go Set, July 31st, 1968, featuring a lift-out experience poster. When 24-year-old Shreveport native James Davenport talked his way into photographing a Jimi Hendrix concert at Shreveport's Municipal Auditorium in July of 1968, he had no way of knowing he was photographing history. The then 24-year-old simply wanted to get photos of Hendrix's performance for a newspaper article. He explains, "When I found out that Hendrix was going to be here, I came over the afternoon of the show and talked to a security guy." Davenport said, "I told him I'd just gotten out of the army and I was an ex-paratrooper, and so was Hendrix. And I had done work in the military for Army Times and Stars and Stripes. I still had what they called a stringer card, a photographer's ID card, and I was going to write an article and submit it to Army Times about Hendrix's rise to fame," Davenport said. The security guard told Davenport to return an hour before the show. He came back and was ushered to an area inside the security barricade mere feet from the stage. "I stayed there the whole show," Davenport said. "Every time he switched guitars, every time he tuned up, every time he smoked a cigarette, we had a running conversation." Davenport had recently begun experimenting with Kodachrome and shot 2 rolls of color film during the concert. The intense interest in the photos, according to Davenport, is because of the blue custom-made Fender guitar Hendrix is playing in many of the photos. The Biscayne blue color, Davenport said, was specifically made to match a Chevrolet Chevelle that belonged to Hendrix. The blue Fender guitar and a black Les Paul guitar, also used in the Shreveport show, were both stolen a few days later, when Hendrix appeared in New Orleans. He had the Fender guitar a total of 3 or 4 days before it was stolen. Hendrix's bad luck was Davenport's good fortune. His photos of Hendrix's performance at the Shreveport Municipal Auditorium are the only known color photos of Hendrix playing the blue Fender guitar. The photos have since taken on a life of their own. In 2010, Davenport's photo was used on the back cover of Valleys of Neptune, a posthumously released Jimi Hendrix compilation album. That concludes this installment of the series. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we will begin the deep dive into August of 1968 of the Hendrix story, including the second North American tour, along with more about the recording of their third album, Electric Ladyland. Don't forget to subscribe for future content updates. And by the way, if you have any stories or anecdotes to contribute, we would love to hear from you.